This is task 5 of the first sample assessment for personal tax. Task 5 is about national insurance contributions. So for part A, Miss A and Mr L are employed by G Limited. Miss A's gross salary for 24-25 was £67,400 and Mr L's gross salary for the same tax year was £32,780. So we need to complete the following statements. We should ignore the employment allowance. So the employment allowance is for small employers, that if they're really small, then they get effectively an allowance for a national insurance. They don't have to pay so much. It's so that the government can support small businesses. Now we need to enter answers in whole pounds, and if the answer is 0, enter 0. So remember, if you don't follow the instructions in the question, then the computer software will not recognise your answer. So for the first one then, the total Class 1 National Insurance contributions for Miss A. So remember, Miss A earns £67,400. Now there are some thresholds related to this, so let's go and have a look at the reference materials to remind ourselves. So in section 13 of the reference materials, so we can see that for Class 1 employee, so if they earn below 12,570, then they don't have to pay any national insurance at all. And then between 12,570 and 50,270, they're going to pay national insurance at a rate of 8%. And then if it's above that threshold, then they pay at 2%. So notice it's a little bit different to how we would think about income tax, where we would deduct the personal allowance before we start going through the bands. But for national insurance, we start at 0 and we have our first threshold, then the second threshold, and we tax accordingly. So for Miss A then, we've got a total of 67,400. So the first threshold then is 12,570, and they pay no national insurance on that. And then above that, we've got the gap between 50,270 and 12,570, which is a total of 37,700. And we'd pay national insurance at 8%. So that's going to be 3,016. And then above that, so we've got the 67,400, her total income, less the second threshold of 50,270. So here we have 17,130, which would be taxed at 2%. And that's going to be 342.60. So the total national insurance is 3,359. Remember, it's asking to work in whole pounds, so 3,359. And then what about for Mr. L? So Mr. L is earning 32,780, so a little bit less in this case. So let's go through that. So we've got the 32,780. Again, the first threshold, 12,570, is free of national insurance. And then we just need to work out the difference between the 32,780 and that threshold. So we've got 20,210, and that's going to be taxed at 8%, which is £1,616.80. So again, rounding, it's going to be 1,617. So remember that 20,210 is the difference between the salary, 32,780, and the first threshold. Then the third part asks us, what is the employer Class 1 National Insurance contributions payable by G Limited in respect of both of the employees? So again, let's have a look at the reference materials to remind us how this works. So for the employer, again, we've got the first threshold of 9,100, so there's nothing to pay for that. and then above that figure it's 13.8%. So this is very similar to the last calculation we did. So for Miss A, we've got the salary of 67,400. So of that, 9,100 has no national insurance to pay. And then everything above that would be at a rate of 13.8%. So if we take the 67,400, take away 9,100, that gives us 58,300, and that's going to be at 13.8%. So there is 8,045 to pay for that. And then for the second person, we've got 32,780. Again, we get 9,100, which incurs no national insurance, and then the difference between 32,780 and the 9,100 gives us 23,680, and we pay 13.8% national insurance on that, which is 326,784. So the total that the employer needs to pay here is the combination of these two. So we have 11,314 to pay. Then in part B of the question, we've got some true-false statements to deal with. So Mr. T has two part-time jobs. One pays 7,500 per year and the other pays 8,700 per year. Mr. T will pay no national insurance contributions. So remember what our thresholds are. It's the 12,570. Well, both of those figures, those two employments, are less than the 12,570. So he won't pay any national insurance for the first job and won't pay any national insurance for the second job. So yes, that is true. There will be no national insurance to pay, and we treat each job separately. And then the second one, employers must have more than 10 employees to be entitled to the employment allowance. So the way that this works is that the total of secondary class 1 national insurance of employers is reduced by £5,000 per year. Okay, so this is an allowance for each employer, not for each employee. So if an employer's total national insurance liability is less than 5,000, then they pay nothing at all. Yes, this is quite good. It helps to support those small employers. But there are some exceptions though. If we have a company with just one director and no other employees, then that company cannot claim the allowance. Also, if they have national insurance liabilities of more than £100,000 in the year before the claim, then you can't have the employment allowance for that either. So if you're a really big company, then you can't use this allowance. But there's no requirement to have any number of employees to be able to use this allowance. So in this question it said employers must have more than 10 employees to get the allowance, so that is false. Okay, you don't need to have any number of employees. The only issue relating to employees, if it's a company with just one director and nobody else, they would be ineligible for the allowance.